$75,000. That was the exact price tag on a human life. Nebula's parents didn't even try to negotiate. They eagerly took the cashier's check, shoved her meager belongings into a single frayed duffel bag, and handed her over to a man whose entire reputation was built on broken bones and shallow, unmarked graves. She braced herself for the absolute worst. She thought she belonged to the beast now. But a different predator was waiting in the shadows, and he had a completely different use for her. Cigarette smoke hung in the cramped living room like spoiled milk, thick and yellowed, coating the back of Nebula's throat with every shallow breath. She sat on the edge of the floral sofa, her hands wedged between her knees. The upholstery scratched bare skin where her jeans rode up. She focused intently on a brown water stain on the ceiling. It looked vaguely like a distorted skull. Anything was better than looking at her father. Richard Morgan's hands shook as he uncapped the heavy fountain pen. The tremor wasn't from guilt. It was the familiar, desperate twitch of a man who needed his next hit, his next drink, his next spin at the roulette wheel. Beside him, Nebula's mother, Helen, stood with her arms crossed tight over her chest, chewing a ragged thumbnail. She smelled intensely of cheap lavender perfume and stale gin. Across the splintered coffee table sat Wallace Denton. Denton took up too much space. He was a massive slab of a man, poring over the edges of the flimsy folding chair they had offered him. He smelled of heavy musk, roasted garlic, and something sharply metallic, like old copper coins left out in the sun. He didn't look at Nebula's parents. His small, wet eyes were fixed entirely on her. They crawled over her collarbones, lingered on the pulse, fluttering at her neck, and settled heavily on her mouth. Nebula felt a wave of cold nausea ripple through her stomach, but she forced her face to remain completely blank. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a whimper. She had stopped expecting her parents to protect her when she was 12. Being sold to a local monster to clear a gambling debt was, sickeningly, just the logical conclusion to her 21 years of existence in this house. "Sign the paper, Richard," Denton rumbled. His voice was a wet gravel crunch. "My patience is a depreciating asset." The pen scratched against the heavy parchment. It was a ludicrously formal document for human trafficking, disguised as an indefinite contract of domestic servitude. But they all knew what it really meant. Denton bought toys. He broke them. When he was done, they disappeared. "There," Richard gasped, shoving the paper across the table. He didn't look at Nebula. "It's done. The 75,000. The debt is clear." Denton smiled. It was a terrible, asymmetrical thing, revealing a gold incisor. He snapped his thick fingers, and one of the two silent, hulking men standing by the front door tossed a leather briefcase onto the table. It landed with a heavy, muffled thud. "Get your bag, sweetheart," Denton said, finally addressing Nebula. "We have a lot of adjusting to do." Nebula's fingernails dug so hard into her own palms that she felt the skin break. The sharp sting grounded her. She stood up slowly. The linoleum peeled beneath the sole of her right sneaker. She slung the canvas duffel bag over her shoulder. It weighed almost nothing. It contained 3 T-shirts, a pair of jeans, a toothbrush, and a stolen paperback copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. She took one step toward Denton. Then, the front door of the house simply ceased to exist. It wasn't a Hollywood explosion. It was a sudden, violent splintering of wood and metal as the hinges gave way to the brutal force of a matte black battering ram. The door crashed inward, taking part of the drywall with it. Plaster dust choked the narrow hallway. Before Denton's men could even reach into their ill-fitting jackets, a series of muted, coughing sounds filled the room. Thwip, thwip, thwip. It sounded like heavy textbooks being dropped on a carpet. The man nearest the door collapsed sideways, his face hitting the edge of the television stand with a sickening crack. The second man folded at the knees, a neat, dark hole appearing suddenly in his throat. He gurgled, grasping at his collar, before slumping onto the stained rug. Helen screamed, a high, piercing, useless sound. Richard scrambled backward, slipping on the cheap rug and falling hard onto his tailbone, knocking the briefcase of money to the floor. Stacks of $100 bills spilled out like green innards. Nebula didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of cordite mixed violently with the lavender and stale smoke. Through the ruined doorway stepped a man who did not belong in this neighborhood. He was tall, lean, and moved with a terrifying economy of motion. There was no swagger, no posturing. Every step was precise. He wore a charcoal wool suit that looked as soft as water, paired with a crisp white shirt minus a tie. His dark hair was neatly swept back, though a few stray strands fell across his forehead. But it was his eyes that caught Nebula. They were the color of slate, and they looked incredibly, devastatingly tired. Ashton Patterson. Even isolated in her miserable existence, Nebula knew that face. Everyone in the city knew the head of the Patterson Syndicate. He was the apex predator. Denton was a thug who ran loan sharks and dirty mechanics. Patterson owned the judges, the docks, and the city council. Ashton stepped over the dead man in the hallway without breaking his stride. He stopped a few feet from Denton, who was now frozen half out of his chair, a snub-nosed revolver halfway out of his waistband. "Wallace," Ashton said. His voice was quiet, smooth. It didn't boom. It seeped into the corners of the room. "Patterson!" Denton spat, though a sheen of fresh sweat suddenly coated his broad forehead. "This is private business. You have no jurisdiction in this ward. You made a mess at the shipyard yesterday, Wallace," Ashton replied, pulling a silencer-equipped pistol from inside his jacket with agonizing slowness. "One of my foremen lost a hand because your men were careless with a shipment. I can compensate." "I don't want your money," Ashton interrupted, his tone shifting from conversational to something infinitely colder. "I want to correct the local ecosystem." Ashton didn't hesitate. He raised the gun and shot Denton perfectly between the eyes. The sound was sharp, louder than the others. Denton's massive body tipped backward, the flimsy folding chair collapsing completely under his dead weight. He hit the floor with a heavy, wet thud. A dark pool immediately began to spread across the linoleum, soaking into the edges of the spilled $100 bills. Nebula stared at the fresh corpse. She felt an absurd urge to laugh. 5 minutes ago, that man owned her life. Now, he was leaking onto her mother's horrific rug. Ashton slowly lowered the gun, engaging the safety with a quiet click. He looked down at the blood, then at Richard and Helen, who were cowering against the wall, weeping hysterically. He looked at them with profound disgust. Finally, his slate eyes shifted to Nebula. She held his gaze. She didn't cower. She didn't cry. Her hands were still shaking, but she locked her knees to keep from collapsing. She expected him to shoot her, too, to clean up the witnesses. Instead, Ashton stepped forward, his polished Oxfords avoiding the blood by an inch. He reached down and picked up the contract Denton had just forced her father to sign. He read it quickly, a small muscle ticking in his jaw. He folded the paper and slid it into his inside pocket. "Are you Nebula?" he asked. She swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "Yes." "Is that all you're bringing?" He gestured with his chin to a canvas duffel. "Yes." Ashton turned his back on her parents, completely ignoring their whimpering. "Walk out the door, take a left, and get into the black vehicle at the end of the curb. Don't speak to my men." Nebula's grip tightened on the strap of her bag. The terror, momentarily paused by the shock of the gunfire, came rushing back. She wasn't free. The ownership had simply transferred hands, from a pig to a wolf. "Why?" she croaked. Ashton paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder. The exhaustion in his eyes was stark, genuine. "Because you are the only person alive who knows where Richard Morgan hid the encrypted flash drives he stole from me 3 years ago. And you are going to find them for me." Before she could process the words, he turned away. "Get in the car, Nebula. I won't ask twice." Silence inside the vehicle was heavy, pressing against Nebula's eardrums like deep water. She sat stiffly in the back of the armored SUV, her knees pressed tightly together. The interior was cavernous, smelling sharply of new, expensive leather and a faint trace of peppermint. The tinted windows were thick, warping the passing city streetlights into blurred neon streaks. The ambient noise of the city, sirens, shouting, grinding gears, was completely muted, entirely blocked by the reinforced glass and steel. Ashton Patterson sat opposite her in the rear-facing seat. The space between them felt like a mile, though their knees were only 2 feet apart. He had opened a slim leather portfolio and was writing something with a silver pen. He didn't glance up. He didn't offer her water. He didn't speak. Nebula stared at him, her chest tight. This was worse in a way than Denton. With Denton, she knew the exact parameters of the horror: brutality, physical violence, degradation. She could prepare a mental fortress for that. She could dissociate. But this man was a void. He was reading a spreadsheet, while blood from the man he just murdered probably still dotted the cuffs of his trousers. Her stomach churned violently. The combination of the smooth, gliding motion of the heavy car and the lingering adrenaline made her lightheaded. She dug her nails into her palms again, reopening the crescent moon cuts she'd made earlier. "If you throw up on the upholstery, I will be deeply annoyed," Ashton said. His voice was flat, and he still hadn't looked up from his papers. Nebula flinched. "I'm not going to throw up. You are hyperventilating. Your skin is clammy, and you are staring intensely at a single spot on the floorboard. Typical signs of vasovagal syncope," he noted, turning a page. "Breathe through your nose. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out." She wanted to snap at him. She wanted to scream. Instead, she took a shaky breath through her nose. The faint scent of peppermint grounded her slightly. "I don't know anything about any flash drives," she said, her voice sounding raspy, pathetic in the quiet luxury of the cabin. Ashton finally stopped writing. He capped the pen and closed the portfolio, resting it on the seat beside him. He looked at her. Really looked at her. His gaze wasn't invasive like Denton's. It was clinical. Like an appraiser looking at a piece of antique furniture with minor water damage. 3 years ago, your father worked as a low-level accountant in one of my legitimate shipping fronts," Ashton said softly. He was feeding a gambling habit. He noticed discrepancies, money moving in ways he didn't understand. Instead of coming to his superiors, he got ambitious. He downloaded 3 ledgers onto a set of encrypted drives and tried to blackmail my chief financial officer. Nebula stared. "My father is a coward. He couldn't blackmail a parking attendant." "Desperation be Morgan's temporary courage," Ashton countered. "When my men went to retrieve the drives, he panicked. He hid them. We dismantled his life. We drained his accounts. We ensured he couldn't find work anywhere but the gutter. We waited for him to retrieve them so he could sell them. He never did. He claims he forgot where he put them in his drug-induced haze." "Then why do you need me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Because Richard Morgan is a creature of habit. And he is incredibly stupid, Ashton stated plainly. He didn't trust a bank locker, and he didn't trust his wife. He hid them somewhere close to you, somewhere he thought they would be safe. I've monitored you for 3 years, Nebula. I know where you go, what you eat, the books you check out of the library. You don't have them on your person, and you don't know you have them. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. You've been watching me for 3 years. I have a team watching you, he corrected, leaning back against the plush leather. I don't have the time to personally observe a college dropout working at a diner. But when my men reported that your father was selling you to Wallace Denton to clear his gambling debts, the situation required my personal intervention. To save me? She asked, the words dripping with sudden, uncharacteristic sarcasm. Ashton's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. Do not confuse me with a savior, Miss Morgan. I intercepted Denton because Denton is an animal. If he got his hands on you, he would have broken your mind and your body within a week. If you were dead or catatonic, I would never find those drives. You are an asset. I protect my assets. The brutal honesty felt like a physical slap. She wasn't a girl. She wasn't a victim. She was a puzzle box. And when I find them, Nebula asked, her jaw tight, when you get what you want, what happens to me then? Ashton held her gaze for a long moment. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, suddenly looking incredibly weary again. When you find them, I will give you a new passport, a new name, and enough money to disappear. Until then, you belong to me. He said it without malice, without heat. It was just a fact. Like the sky was dark and the car was heavy. Nebula looked away, staring out the darkened window. She should be terrified. She should be crying for her mother, begging for her life. But as the adrenaline drained away, leaving a hollow ache in her chest, she realized something strange. She felt safer in the back of this car with a mass murderer than she had ever felt in her own home. The contradiction made her stomach twist again. She pulled her knees tighter against her chest, closed her eyes, and let the rhythmic hum of the tires carry her into the dark. The tires crunched over thick, crushed gravel. Nebula woke with a jolt, a sharp pain shooting up her neck from the awkward angle she had slept in. She blinked, disoriented in the dim cabin. Ashton was no longer doing paperwork. He was staring out the window, his profile illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the trees. The SUV came to a smooth halt. "We're here," Ashton said, his voice quiet. He didn't wait for his driver to open the door. He pushed it open himself and stepped out into the night air. Nebula grabbed her frayed duffel bag and scrambled out after him, her legs stiff and aching. When she looked up, the breath caught in her throat. She had expected a mansion, something ostentatious with marble columns and sweeping driveways, the kind of gaudy display of wealth the mobsters in the movies favored. This was not that. The Patterson estate was a fortress carved into the side of a dense, forested mountain. It was heavily geometric, built of raw concrete, dark steel, and massive panes of reinforced glass. It looked like a brutalist bunker, imposing and impenetrable. The air up here was freezing, sharp with the scent of pine needles, wet earth, and a faint chemical tang of industrial bleach. Men in dark tactical gear stood at various checkpoints along the perimeter. They held automatic rifles across their chests. None of them looked at Nebula. "Stay close," Ashton instructed, walking up the wide stone steps toward the heavy, steel-reinforced double doors. Nebula followed, her cheap sneakers making virtually no sound compared to his heavy footfalls. The interior of the house matched the exterior. It was vast, echoing, and terrifyingly cold. The floors were polished dark stone, the walls bare concrete. There was no art, no warmth. It smelled of ozone, beeswax, and floor cleaner. A woman stood waiting in the cavernous foyer. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, wearing a severe grey dress and a tight bun. "Mrs. Gable," Ashton said, handing his coat to a silent guard who materialized from the shadows. "This is Nebula. She requires a room in the East Wing. Have Dr. Aris examine her in an hour. Provide her with whatever she needs." "Yes, Mr. Patterson," the woman replied. Her voice was clipped, heavily accented. Eastern European, maybe. She looked at Nebula with mild, clinical disinterest. "You will stay in your room," Ashton told Nebula, turning to face her. "Do not wander. The security systems are sensitive, and my guards do not ask questions before they react to an intruder in the residential wings. We will begin sorting through your father's mess tomorrow." Without waiting for a response, he walked away, his footsteps echoing down a long, dark corridor. Nebula stood awkwardly, clutching her bag. Mrs. Gable sighed softly. "Follow me, please." The room Nebula was given was massive, larger than her entire family apartment. But it felt like a high-end prison cell. The bed was enormous, dressed in heavy white linens. There was a large window, but the glass was thick, and she could see the faint glint of wire mesh embedded within it. The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating. She walked into the attached bathroom. The marble floor was heated. She stared at her reflection in the mirror over the sink. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was sallow, her dark hair tangled and greasy. There was a smear of dust on her cheek from her ruined hallway. Mechanically, she stripped off her clothes. They smelled like the apartment, like smoke, despair, and Denton's awful cologne. She kicked them into a pile in the corner and stepped into the massive glass shower. The water was instantly, blisteringly hot. Nebula leaned her forehead against the cold glass tile, and finally, for the first time that night, she let herself cry. She didn't sob out loud. She just let the tears fall, mingling with the hot water washing over her face. She scrubbed her skin until it was red and raw, using a heavy bar of soap that smelled faintly of sandalwood and cedar. She felt completely untethered. She was a hostage, a pawn in a game she didn't even know the rules to. Ashton Patterson didn't view her as human. He viewed her as a map. After 30 minutes, she stepped out, wrapping herself in a thick, ridiculously soft towel. A gentle knock on the bedroom door made her jump. She cautiously opened the bathroom door. A short, balding man in a neat suit was standing near the foot of the bed, holding a medical bag. Mrs. Gable stood just behind him. "I am Dr. Aris," the man said warmly. It was the first warm tone she had heard all night. "Mr. Patterson asked me to ensure you are unharmed. May I take your blood pressure?" Nebula nodded numbly, clutching the towel tighter. She sat on the edge of the massive bed. The doctor was efficient. He checked her pulse, her eyes, her throat. He noted the crescent moon cuts on her palms and gently cleaned them with an antiseptic wipe that stung fiercely. Slightly malnourished, elevated heart rate, but otherwise physically intact, Dr. Aris murmured, mostly to himself. He packed his bag. "I will leave a mild sedative on the nightstand. I suggest you take it. Your nervous system has had a profound shock." "Thank you," she whispered. When they left, Nebula noticed a tray of food had been placed on the small table by the window. Her stomach gave a violent lurch of hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. She practically lunged at the tray. It was simple: roasted chicken, wild rice, and steamed green beans. But to Nebula, it smelled like absolute heaven. She ate like a starving animal, using her fingers when the fork felt too clumsy in her shaking hands. The rich flavor of the meat, The butter on the rice, it grounded her in her physical body. She felt a wave of intense shame at her lack of decorum, but she couldn't stop until the plate was completely clean. She drank the large glass of water provided, took the small white pill the doctor had left, and crawled under the heavy duvet. The sheets were incredibly soft, smelling faintly of clean linen and starch. As the sedative began to drag her down into a heavy, dreamless dark, a thought drifted into her mind, uninvited and strange. Ashton Patterson was a monster. He murdered a man in cold blood right in front of her. He was holding her against her will, but he had given her a hot shower, a doctor, and a warm meal. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't looked at her with the hungry, wet eyes that Denton had. As the drugs pulled her under, she realized she was terrified of Ashton Patterson, but she was not afraid of him. It was a contradiction that made no sense, but it was the last thing she felt before the world faded to black. Tomorrow, she would have to prove her worth to the devil. Tomorrow, she would have to find out what her father had hidden. Morning came abruptly. The harsh glare of high-altitude sunlight pierced the thick mesh window, slicing across the heavy white duvet. Nebula woke with a sharp gasp, her heart kicking against her ribs before her brain could even register where she was. The plush room, the brutalist concrete walls, the heavy silence. She threw off the covers. The heated floorboards were a jarring contrast to the frigid air in the bedroom. On the small table near the door, a fresh set of clothes had been laid out, neatly folded. Dark jeans, a thick grey cashmere sweater, and a pair of sturdy leather boots that looked brand new, but felt broken in. Mrs. Gable's work, no doubt. Nebula dressed quickly. The cashmere was criminally soft against her skin. It made her feel like an imposter. When she opened her door, a guard was waiting in the hall. He didn't speak, just gave a curt nod and gestured for her to follow. Their footsteps echoed down the long, subterranean corridors. The compound smelled of ozone and filtered air, utterly sterile. Ashton's office was a massive vault of a room at the end of the east wing. 3 walls were lined with monitors displaying endless streams of shipping manifests, security feeds, and financial tickers. The 4th wall was entirely glass, overlooking a sheer drop into a jagged, pine-choked valley. Ashton was standing by a massive oak desk, pouring dark tea from a cast-iron pot. He wore a crisp navy suit today, though he had discarded the jacket. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled to the elbows, exposing forearms corded with lean muscle and a faint, jagged scar running near his left wrist. "Sit," he commanded softly, not looking up. Nebula sat in a heavy leather chair opposite the desk. The leather groaned under her weight. "Did you sleep?" Ashton asked, pushing a steaming ceramic cup across the desk toward her. "Yes." She stared at the dark liquid. It smelled intensely of bergamot and smoke. "The sedative helped? Good, because we are out of time." Ashton sat down, steepling his fingers. His slate eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the thin veneer of calm she had managed to build during the shower. "Wallace Denton's crew is currently tearing apart your parents' apartment. They found his body 3 hours ago. They know I did it, but they don't know why. Yet." Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest. "My parents are fine," Ashton interrupted flatly. "My men relocated them to a motel outside city limits. They are currently intoxicated and complaining about the lack of room service. They are irrelevant. What is relevant is that Denton's lieutenants will start looking for you by nightfall. If they figure out you are the key to the drives, this becomes a war." Nebula's hands began to tremble. She gripped the warm teacup, letting the heat seep into her icy fingers. "I told you, I don't know where he hid them." You don't know consciously, Ashton corrected, leaning forward. Think about Richard. Dissect him for me. He is a narcissist, a coward, and an addict. He operates on the path of least resistance. When he panicked 3 years ago, where would he put something small, valuable, and damning? He wouldn't bury it. He hates manual labor. He doesn't have a safe deposit box, Nebula said, her brow furrowing. His credit is completely destroyed. He can't even get a library card. Did he have a locker? A gym? Nebula let out a short, bitter laugh. My father hasn't exercised since the 90s. Ashton didn't smile. He just watched her, waiting. He spent most of his time at the track or at the OTB off 5th, Nebula murmured, staring into her tea as if it held the answers. When he was broke, he just sat on the couch. Or... She paused, a sudden memory surfacing, sour and irritating. Or he came to my work. Ashton went perfectly still. Where do you work? A diner. Rusty's down on 14th Street. I've worked there since I dropped out of community college. She chewed her bottom lip, tasting old skin. He used to come in during my graveyard shifts. He knew the manager was asleep in the back. He'd sit in the corner booth for hours, drinking free coffee and eating whatever I messed up on the grill. He said it was his office. Ashton's eyes narrowed slightly. Did he have access to the employee areas? No, but... Nebula's breath hitched. A heavy stone of realization dropped in her stomach. There's a coat room in the back. It's right next to the bathrooms. Customers use it in the winter. Employees have a row of rusted lockers in the corner of it. Half of them don't lock. Did he know which one was yours? Yes, she whispered. Her voice sounded hollow. 3 years ago, I had this awful, puffy winter coat. I hated it. I left it in locker number 4 permanently. Just used it when I had to take out the trash in the snow. He used to complain about how ugly it was. Ashton stood up smoothly, grabbing his suit jacket from the back of his chair. Let's go. Now. Every second we waste is a second Denton's crew gets closer to realizing your value, Ashton stated, slipping his arms into the tailored jacket. He checked the magazine of his pistol before sliding it into a shoulder holster. Drink your tea, Nebula. We are going to Rusty's. The ride down the mountain was sickeningly fast. The armored SUV took the winding curves with aggressive precision, the heavy tires protesting loudly against the asphalt. Nebula gripped the grab handle above her door, her knuckles stark white. Ashton sat beside her, radiating a quiet, dangerous energy. He was no longer the clinical appraiser. He was a predator, calculating distance and angles. Rusty's diner sat on a miserable stretch of 14th Street, wedged between a pawn shop with barred windows and an abandoned laundromat. The neon sign above the door flickered erratically, buzzing like an angry hornet. When Ashton stepped out of the SUV, he looked completely alien. His bespoke suit, the polished leather of his shoes, the sheer, imposing stillness of his posture. It was a violent contrast to the cracked sidewalk and the overflowing trash cans. Keep your head down, he instructed, his hand resting lightly against the small of her back. The touch was impersonal, guiding rather than comforting, but it sent a strange jolt straight up her spine. He pushed open the heavy glass door. The bell above it gave a pathetic, muted jingle. The diner smelled exactly as Nebula remembered. Burnt coffee, heavy bacon grease, and the sharp chemical tang of cheap pine floor cleaner. The linoleum was a sticky, checkered nightmare of yellow and brown. At 2 in the afternoon, it was mostly empty. A lone trucker sat at the counter, chewing methodically, while an exhausted waitress, Nebula's co-worker Brenda, wiped down a booth with a grey rag. Brenda looked up. Her eyes widened, flicking from Nebula to the imposing, terrifyingly well-dressed man beside her. "Nebula!" Brenda squeaked, dropping the rag. You didn't show up for your shift yesterday. Mr. Henderson was pissed." "I quit, Brenda," Nebula said quickly, keeping her voice low. "I just need to get my things from the back." Brenda eyed Ashton nervously. He simply stared back, his expression so blank and intensely cold that Brenda immediately looked away, swallowing hard. Okay. Henderson is in the office. Just make it quick." Ashton guided Nebula down the narrow hallway past the bathrooms. The air here was damp, smelling of mildew and old plumbing. The coat room was a cramped closet with a single flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. Along the left wall stood a row of dented, olive-green metal lockers. Nebula walked over to locker number 4. Her hands were sweating. The handle was stiff, rusted from years of humidity. She yanked it hard, and the metal door popped open with a loud screech. Inside hung the ugly, puffy winter coat. It was a violently bright, faded mustard yellow. "Is this it?" Ashton asked. Standing so close behind her, she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "Yes." Nebula reached out, her fingers brushing the cheap nylon. It felt gross, coated in a fine layer of diner grease. She plunged her hands into the deep front pockets. Lint, a crushed peppermint wrapper, a hardened piece of chewing gum. Nothing. Panic seized her throat. "It's not here!" She frantically checked the inside breast pocket. Empty. She patted down the lining, squeezing the cheap polyester filling. "He wouldn't just drop a drive into a pocket," Ashton said quietly. "He needed it to be secure, but accessible. Feel the seams." Nebula dropped to her knees, pulling the heavy coat off the hook. The floor was sticky against her jeans. She grabbed the bottom hem of the coat, running her fingers tightly along the thick stitching. Halfway across the back hem, the stitching changed. It was thicker, clumsier. Black thread instead of the original yellow. Her breath hitched. "Here." Ashton knelt beside her, the expensive fabric of his trousers pressing into the filthy linoleum without a second thought. He produced a slim, matte black folding knife from his pocket. The blade snapped out with a deadly click. "Hold it taut," he ordered. Nebula pulled the fabric tight. Ashton inserted the tip of the blade under the clumsy black stitches, slicing upward with surgical precision. The seam split open. Nebula reached into the gap. Her fingers brushed against something hard, cold, and metallic. She pulled it out. It wasn't an encrypted flash drive. It was a key. A heavy, brass key with a thick, square head. Stamped into the metal were 3 numbers, 418. Nebula stared at it, her heart sinking. A profound, exhausting hatred for her father washed over her. He couldn't just hide the drives. He had to make it a game. He had to be clever. "It's not the drives," she whispered, her voice breaking. She felt tears of frustration prick the corners of her eyes. She was useless to Ashton now. He was going to throw her back to the wolves. Ashton gently took the key from her trembling fingers. He didn't look angry. He studied the brass under the flickering fluorescent light. "No," he said, his voice a low, steady hum. "It's a safety deposit key. Second-tier bank, judging by the cut. Probably independent." He looked down at her, his slate eyes catching the dim light. "Your father is an idiot, Nebula. But you are not." He closed his hand over the key, slipping it into his pocket. Then he did something entirely unexpected. He reached out and lightly brushed a smudge of dust off her cheek with his thumb. His skin was rough, calloused, but the touch was startlingly gentle. "We are one step closer," he murmured. "Stand up." Before she could process the touch, the diner's back door, the heavy steel fire exit at the end of the hallway, burst open with a deafening crash. Bright alley daylight flooded the dim hallway, silhouetting 3 massive figures. The smell of cheap cigars and unwashed bodies instantly overpowered the mildew. "Well, well," a voice rasped from the doorway. It was a voice Nebula recognized from her living room. Denton's men. Looks like the boss was right. The little bird flew back to the nest. Ashton didn't flinch. He didn't even sigh. He simply stood up, positioning his body entirely between Nebula and the open door, his right hand slipping seamlessly beneath his suit jacket. The hallway was roughly 4 feet wide. It was an impossible space for a gunfight, a brutal bottleneck of damp drywall and rusted metal lockers. The man in the center raised a sawed-off shotgun. The barrel looked obscenely wide in the dim light. Nebula didn't consciously decide to move. Her knees simply gave out. She collapsed onto the sticky, checkered linoleum, curling her body into a tight ball, her hands flying up to cover her ears. The roar of the shotgun in the enclosed space was a physical blow. It didn't just hurt her ears, it rattled her teeth and punched all the air out of her lungs. Sparks showered down like a violent fireworks display as the buckshot shredded the top half of the olive-green lockers, tearing through the metal just inches above where Ashton had been standing a fraction of a second before. But Ashton wasn't there. He had dropped low, pivoting on his polished heel. His pistol coughed 3 times. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The man with the shotgun jerked backward as if hit by a speeding truck, his weapon clattering onto the floor. The second man, positioned near the doorframe, barely managed to clear his pistol from his waistband before a neat, dark hole appeared in the bridge of his nose. He dropped like a stone, his head bouncing once against the concrete threshold of the fire exit. The third man, massive, wearing a stained leather jacket and smelling strongly of sour body odor and cheap tobacco, didn't try to shoot. He lunged. He crashed into Ashton, driving the syndicate boss hard against the opposite wall. The drywall cracked under the impact, a cloud of white dust raining down on them. Nebula kept her eyes squeezed shut, but she couldn't block out the sounds. The heavy grunts of exertion, the sickening thud of a fist hitting ribs, the sharp intake of breath, then a wet, tearing sound. A heavy body slumped to the floor right next to Nebula's boots. She smelled it before she opened her eyes, the hot, metallic stench of fresh blood, thick and overwhelming, mingling with the sudden, humiliating scent of voided bowels. She forced her eyes open. The man in the leather jacket lay face down. A dark pool was spreading rapidly from beneath his chest, soaking into the grout lines of the linoleum. Ashton leaned heavily against the dented lockers. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged rhythms. The matte black folding knife in his right hand dripped onto the floor. His crisp white shirt was ruined, smeared with a wide, bright slash of crimson near the collar, though it didn't look like his own blood. He didn't gloat. He didn't say a word. He methodically wiped the blade on the dead man's leather jacket, snapped it shut, and returned it to his pocket. Then he retrieved his pistol from where he had dropped it during the struggle, ejected the magazine, checked it, and slammed it back into the grip. He looked down at Nebula. "Get up," he said. His voice was incredibly hoarse, stripped of its usual smooth veneer. Nebula scrambled backward, her hand slipping in the slick, bloody mess on the floor. She dry-heaved, her stomach contracting violently, but there was nothing left in her to throw up. She managed to get her feet under her, leaning against the wall for support. Her knees shook so violently they knocked together. Ashton stepped over the corpse, grabbing her upper arm. His grip was entirely firm, a steel band pulling her forward. "We are leaving. Now." They didn't go back through the diner. Ashton pushed her toward the open fire exit, stepping carefully over the bodies blocking the threshold. They spilled out into the blinding glare of the alleyway. The air outside felt impossibly fresh, despite the smell of rotting garbage from the nearby dumpsters. The armored SUV was already waiting at the mouth of the alley, its engine purring with a low, aggressive hum. The driver had the rear door open before they even reached the curb. Ashton shoved Nebula inside, practically throwing her onto the leather seats before climbing in after her and slamming the heavy door shut. "Drive," he commanded. The SUV surged forward, throwing Nebula back against the plush upholstery. She stared at Ashton. He was leaning his head back against the headrest, his eyes closed. His chest was still heaving. A thin line of sweat coated his forehead, and there was a dark bruise already blossoming along his left cheekbone. He wasn't a phantom. He wasn't a god. He was a man who just stabbed another human being to death in a filthy hallway, and the exertion had cost him. Nebula looked down at her own hands. They were smeared with the dead man's blood from where she had slipped on the floor. The red was stark against her pale skin. She stared at it, a bizarre, hysterical bubble of laughter rising in her throat. She swallowed it down, clamping her hand over her mouth. Ashton opened his eyes and looked at her shaking, bloody hands. He reached into a compartment between the seats, pulled out a thick cotton towel, and tossed it into her lap. "Wipe your hands," he ordered quietly. "And regulate your breathing. The panic is entirely useless to us both right now." Nebula grabbed the towel, scrubbing fiercely at her skin until it burned. "They found me," she whispered, the reality of the violence finally catching up to her. "They were going to kill me." "They were going to take you," Ashton corrected, turning his head to look out the tinted window. "Denton's men are crude, but they aren't completely stupid. They tracked you to your workplace, hoping for a lead. They found one, which means we have less than an hour before the rest of the city knows you are in my custody." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key. "Fortunately," Ashton murmured, running his thumb over the stamped 418. "I know exactly which lock this opens." The First Fidelity Depository sat on the edge of the garment district, squeezed tightly between a wholesale fabric warehouse and a dilapidated parking garage. It was not a bank. It was a private, independent vault facility, the kind of place that didn't ask for social security numbers and didn't report to the IRS. The lobby smelled of ozone, old dust, and ozone. Faded burgundy carpet covered the floor, and the only light came from a row of buzzing fluorescent tubes overhead. An elderly man sat behind bulletproof glass, peering at a tiny, portable television. He barely glanced up when Ashton and Nebula walked in. Ashton approached the glass. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't threaten the man. He simply slid the brass key under the metal tray, followed immediately by a tightly banded stack of $100 bills. It had to be at least $10,000. The old man looked at the money, then at the key. He didn't look at Ashton's bruised face or the faint, rust-colored stains on his suit trousers. He simply hit a button under his desk. A heavy, reinforced steel door to their right clicked open with a loud, metallic clack. "Down the stairs, aisle 4, the clerk mumbled, turning back to his television. The basement vault was freezing. It was a stark, cavernous room, lined floor to ceiling with thousands of identical stainless steel boxes. The silence down here was absolute, thick enough to suffocate in. Nebula wrapped her arms tightly around herself, shivering in her cashmere sweater. Her nerves were utterly frayed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the explosive flash of the shotgun and smelled the copper tang of the hallway. Ashton walked down the rows with predatory grace, counting the numbers etched into the metal. 410. 412, he muttered. He stopped. 418. He inserted the brass key. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. He pulled the long, rectangular metal box from its slot and carried it to a small, private viewing table in the center of the room. Nebula held her breath. This was it. Her ransom. Her F. Morganum. Ashton lifted the lid. Inside the velvet-lined box lay 3 identical, matte black USB flash drives. They were heavy, military-grade encryptions. Ashton exhaled a long, slow breath. The tension that had been rigidly locking his shoulders for the past 24 hours visibly bled away. He reached out, his long fingers hovering over the drives. "Got them," he murmured, a rare edge of satisfaction creeping into his tone. But Nebula wasn't looking at the drives. Her eyes were fixed on the other object in the box. Sitting right next to the millions of dollars worth of blackmail material was a cheap, hot pink, plastic digital watch. The band was frayed, and the digital face was cracked down the middle. Nebula felt the air leave her lungs. Her hand shot out, grabbing the watch before Ashton could stop her. "Don't touch that," Ashton warned sharply, his hand resting on the drives. "It's mine," Nebula whispered, staring at the cracked screen. Her vision blurred with sudden, hot tears. "I bought this for him." Ashton frowned, studying her face. "You bought your father a child's watch?" "I was 10, she said, her voice cracking violently. "I saved my lunch money for 3 months. I bought it at a pharmacy down the street. It was his birthday. He smiled. He put it on." She swallowed the massive lump in her throat, her thumb tracing the broken plastic. "He pawned it 3 days later to bet on a greyhound race. I cried for a week." Ashton watched her silently, his slate eyes unreadable. "Why would he buy it back?" she asked, the tears finally spilling over, hot and humiliating against her cold cheeks. "Why would he keep it in a vault with your ledgers? He sold me to Denton for 75 grand. He didn't care about me. He didn't love me. It was the ultimate, bitter contradiction. Her father had thrown her to a monster to save his own skin, yet he had paid to secure a meaningless, broken piece of pink plastic from her childhood in a fortress. The sheer, irrational reality of it twisted a knife deep in her gut. She hated him. She hated him so much she couldn't breathe. Ashton reached out, his hand wrapping gently over hers. He didn't pull the watch away. He just steadied her shaking hand. "He kept it because Richard Morgan is a creature of immense paranoia," Ashton said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register. He turned her hand over, exposing the back of the watch. "Look." Nebula blinked away her tears, focusing on the stainless steel backing of the cheap watch. Scratched crudely into the metal with a pin or a sharp knife was a long, complex sequence of numbers and letters. R7, 7, B, 9, X4, 2, Q. "The drives are military-grade, Nebula," Ashton explained softly, his thumb brushing against the etched metal. "Without the decryption sequence, they are utterly useless. If they format incorrectly, the data wipes itself. Your father knew this. He needed the code, but he knew he couldn't just write it on a piece of paper." Nebula stared at the scratches. "He didn't keep it because of me." "No," Ashton Ag Morgan, ruthlessly honest. "He used your memory as a mental anchor, something he would never forget, so he knew exactly where the code was hidden. You were a tool for him, just like this watch." The cold truth of it washed over her, freezing the tears on her face. Her father was nothing more than an empty, desperate shell. Ashton released her hand and carefully gathered the 3 drives, slipping them into the breast pocket of his ruined jacket. He picked up the lid of the box. "I have what I need," Ashton said, looking at her across the steel table. "The transaction is complete. You found them." Nebula stood perfectly still in the freezing vault. She clutched the broken pink watch in her fist, its plastic edges digging painfully into her palm. The deal was done. Ashton had promised her a passport, money, and F. Morganum. She could walk out of this bank and disappear. She didn't belong to the beast, and she didn't belong to the wolf anymore. She looked up at Ashton Patterson. His suit was bloodied. His face was bruised. He was a murderer, a syndicate boss, a ruthless predator who viewed human lives as assets on a ledger. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. Ashton held her gaze. The clinical distance that usually masked his eyes was gone, replaced by something heavier, something deeply unsettled. He looked at her not as a map, and not as a puzzle box, but as a person who had just stood in a pool of blood and didn't break. "Now," Ashton said, "I have to figure out how to let you go." Exhaustion hit her the moment the heavy steel door of the depository clicked shut behind them. It wasn't just a physical tiredness. It was a profound, marrow-deep draining of her soul. They sat in the back of the SUV as it navigated the narrow, potholed streets of the garment district. Ashton hadn't spoken since they left the vault. He sat with his head tilted back against the leather headrest, his eyes closed. His breathing was shallow. In the harsh, intermittent glare of passing streetlights, Nebula could see a dark, wet stain spreading across the ribs of his crisp white shirt, previously hidden by the angle of his ruined suit jacket. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice sounded thin, scraping against the oppressive silence of the cabin. Ashton didn't open his eyes. One of Denton's men got a lucky angle with a serrated hunting knife before I took his throat. It's a shallow laceration. It missed the lung. He stated it like he was reporting the weather. A minor inconvenience. "You need a hospital. I need a clean shirt and a secure server," he corrected, finally turning his head to look at her. The slate eyes were heavy, dull with pain, but the sharp intelligence beneath them remained utterly intact. "Hospitals ask questions. Doctors fill out reports. By midnight, Wallace Denton's entire organization will know he is dead. There will be a power vacuum in the south wards. If I show weakness tonight, the lesser predators will try to take a bite out of my territory." Nebula looked down at her lap. Her hands were still stained a rusty brown from the linoleum floor of the diner. She rubbed her thumb against the side of her index finger, feeling the dry, flaky texture of another man's life peeling off her skin. She shouldn't care if Ashton bled out in the back of this car. He was a monster. He traded in violence and extortion. But as the SUV glided smoothly toward the brutalist fortress on the mountain, she realized the terrifying truth. She didn't want him to die. He was the only solid object in a world that had suddenly liquefied around her. When they finally arrived at the estate, the sterility of the compound felt like a physical shock. The air was heavily filtered, smelling of beeswax and industrial cleaner. Ashton dismissed his guards with a sharp flick of his wrist. He didn't walk toward the medical wing. He walked straight to his massive glass-walled office, moving with a stiff, calculated gait that betrayed the pain he was meticulously hiding. "Sit," he ordered, gesturing to the heavy leather chair she had occupied that morning. Nebula sat. The leather groaned. Ashton walked behind his desk. He didn't sit down. Instead, he pulled the 3 matte black flash drives from his pocket and set them heavily on the oak surface. Then he unbuttoned his ruined jacket, wincing slightly as the fabric pulled against the drying blood on his side. He shrugged it off, dropping it onto the floor. He moved to a discreet wall panel, punching in a code. A small safe clicked open. He extracted a thick manila envelope and tossed it onto the desk next to the drives. It landed with a dull smack. "Dr. Aris is waiting in your room," Ashton said, his voice tightening as he pressed a clean handkerchief against his ribs. "He will give you something to help you sleep. Tomorrow morning, my personal driver will take you to an airfield in upstate New York. There is a private charter waiting." Nebula stared at the manila envelope. "What is that?" "Your compensation," Ashton replied. He leaned heavily against the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. Inside is a Canadian passport. The name is Chloe Bennett. It will pass any facial recognition software or border checkpoint in the world. There is also a debit card tied to an offshore shell corporation. It currently holds $250,000. The funds are entirely untraceable. You will fly to Vancouver. From there, you go wherever you want. The words hung in the cold, ozone-scented air. $250,000. F. Morganum. Nebula felt absolutely nothing. No joy. No relief. Just a hollow, ringing emptiness in her chest. She stood up slowly. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She walked over to the desk, her cheap sneakers making no sound against the polished stone floor. She picked up the envelope. It was heavy, thick with the promise of a life that didn't belong to her. "You're just going to let me walk away," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We had a transaction," Ashton stated, his jaw clenched tight against the pain in his side. "You delivered the decryption key. I am delivering your exit. I do not break my contracts, Nebula." "I know what you do," she challenged, looking up into his pale, exhausted face. "I saw you kill 3 men today. I know where you live. I know what you are. Why aren't you burying me in the woods?" Ashton stepped closer. The scent of copper, bergamot, and gunpowder rolled off him in waves. He looked down at her, and the clinical, dead-eyed stare of the syndicate boss finally cracked, revealing the raw, jagged edge of the man underneath. "Because you didn't break," he said softly. "Denton would have snapped your spine for sport. Your father sold you for pocket change. I dragged you through a slaughterhouse. And you didn't break. You stood in the blood and you figured out the puzzle." He reached out, his blood-stained hand hovering just inches from her face, though he didn't touch her. "You do not belong in this world, Nebula. But you survived it. Take the money. Disappear. Do not make me regret my sudden lapse in pragmatism." Nebula stared at him. The contradiction was unbearable. She was a pawn, an asset, a ghost, but in the eyes of the most dangerous man in the city, she saw something no one else had ever given her. Respect. Morning leaked through the heavy wire mesh window of the guest room, painting the concrete walls in stark, unforgiving shades of grey. Nebula hadn't taken the sedative Dr. Aris left for her. She had spent the entire night sitting in the dark, turning the heavy manila envelope over and over in her hands. Chloe Bennett, 24 years old, born in Toronto, a completely blank slate. She looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The frightened, sallow girl who had sat on a floral sofa waiting to be sold to a monster was gone. The eyes staring back at her were hard, shadowed, and profoundly older. The blood was washed from her skin, but she knew it would never truly wash out of her mind. The explosive roar of the shotgun in the diner hallway, the sickening slide of Ashton's knife, the pathetic, broken plastic of her father's watch. She splashed cold water on her face, grabbed her canvas duffel bag, and walked out into the sterile hallway. Ashton was waiting in the cavernous foyer. He wore a fresh, charcoal suit. The bruising on his cheek had deepened to a dark, angry purple, and his posture was rigidly straight, favoring his injured ribs. He looked at her bag. It was the exact same bag she had brought with her from her parents' apartment. "The car is waiting," he said simply. Mrs. Gable stood silently by the massive steel doors, holding them open. Outside, the frigid mountain air bit into Nebula's lungs, sharp and aggressively clean. The armored SUV idled on the crushed gravel driveway. Nebula walked down the wide stone steps. She stopped at the rear door of the vehicle and turned around. Ashton stood on the top step, framed by the brutalist concrete of his fortress. He looked completely isolated, An apex predator, alone in a cage of his own making. She reached into the pocket of her jeans and pulled out the hot pink digital watch. The cheap plastic felt ridiculous against the heavy reality of the morning. "My father didn't keep this because he loved me," Nebula said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet, wind-swept driveway. "He kept it because he was terrified of forgetting the one thing that could keep him alive." She looked at the cracked screen, then tossed the watch onto the gravel. It landed with a pathetic, hollow clatter right at Ashton's polished Oxfords. "I don't need a mental anchor anymore," she told him, her chin lifting slightly. "I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly what I'm leaving behind." Ashton looked down at the broken piece of plastic, then back up at her. A faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It wasn't warm, but it was incredibly genuine. "Goodbye, Chloe," he said. Nebula didn't reply. She climbed into the back of the SUV. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing her in the quiet, peppermint-scented luxury of the cabin. The driver put the vehicle in gear, and they began the long, winding descent down the mountain. Nebula didn't look back at the estate. She didn't look back at the man who had bought her life, soaked it in blood, and then handed it back to her. She opened the manila envelope, pulling out the glossy Canadian passport. She traced the embossed gold crest on the cover. Her father was a coward who hid from the consequences of his actions. He had spent his entire life running from his debts, running from his responsibilities, running from the truth. Nebula wasn't running. She was simply walking away. She slid the passport back into the envelope, leaned her head against the cool tinted glass, and watched the jagged pine trees blur into a solid wall of dark green. The city was far behind her now, a rotting, concrete labyrinth of loan sharks, gambling debts, and shallow graves. She had survived the beast, and she had survived the wolf. Now, she was going to learn how to survive entirely on her own. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the gritty, psychological underworld of mafia storytelling. If you found yourself holding your breath during Nebula's journey from a pawn to a survivor, and appreciated the raw, grounded take on the genre, please hit that like button. It really helps the algorithm recognize quality content. Don't forget to share this video with fellow storytellers and dark romance fans who crave complex characters and real tension. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming original audio dramas and writing breakdowns. See you next time.